Poverty. Joke. You know how to tell when you're in Georgia? Answer. All the houses are on wheels and all the cars are on blocks. My father fed the poor, especially the wayfaring and those who could never feed him in return. We lived on U.S. Highway 1, the thoroughfare from Maine to Florida in those days before interstates, and travelers up and down the East Coast passed the junkyard. It was the road the snowbirds coasted, and the one the vagabonds wore their souls out on. One Sunday afternoon a drunk hobo stumbled into the junkyard. He was hungry, he said, and would my father spare $1 for a hungry man? "Where are you from?" my father asked. "I left Detroit 6 days ago," said the man, "and going to Tampa, Florida." "Walking the whole way?" "I've been getting some rides," he said. The man walked with a limp and talked with a slur. "What's your name?" "Name's Elrod." "Elrod, we just finished dinner, and my wife wouldn't mind fixing you a plate." "She wouldn't mind? Not at all," Daddy said. "You don't have anything to drink with that, do you?" the man asked. "Iced tea," Daddy said, knowing the man hadn't meant tea at all. Elrod had a hard time negotiating the steps. He was obviously very drunk. He reeked of bad wine, and couldn't walk straight. Daddy steadied him by the arm, and they shakily ascended. We children were hiding, peeping out from the door and behind the curtains. On the porch Daddy let go his grip and turned to open the screen door. The man reached for it and pitched forward, swiveling. The upper part of his body actually fell into the house, but on the porch an awful thing happened. One of his legs fell off, and when we saw that, we scattered like partridges, heading to the bedrooms, but not before Daddy snuffed a twinkle from his hazel eyes. Mama was mad as a wet setting hen. "Franklin Ray," she said, "you get that drunk out of here right this minute." "Honey, he just wants something to eat," Daddy said. "We can feed him." He collected the man from out the doorway and helped him to the couch, where he collapsed, and Daddy went back out and brought in the wooden leg, tacked with short straps. The man had not passed out. "I didn't know you had a wooden leg," Daddy said. "Sorry about that." "Want me to help you get it back on?" "Give me a while," mumbled the hobo. "How did you lose your leg?" Daddy said. "Car accident," the man attempted, but his head bobbed and his words emerged garbled. Mama was slamming around the kitchen, heaping potato salad on a plate and warming up the gravy. When she had filled a glass with iced tea, Daddy helped the man to the table. He didn't bother about washing his hands. He sobered considerably after he ate, and they got the leg back on. Daddy drove the man to town and let him out, and he was on his way. Sometimes a family like the Jodes would break down near Baxley and get sent to the junkyard for a part. Daddy had a special place in his heart for the children that poured out of the packed car, dirty and tired. He'd go dig in the freezer for a bag or two of Easter candy he bought cheap a week after Easter, and he'd have Mama make them all bologna sandwiches. He'd help the man find the part he needed and get them on the road. Daddy had a kindness that belied his brusqueness. He was big enough for all of us and a world besides, and he put innocent children and very old people at the center of it. It was so big that most of the time he had to seal it off and pretend it wasn't there. One Christmas Day an elderly man came to the house. He needed money and brought something, his gun, his pocket watch, to sell. He was an ornery man with gray hair and skin so thin it clung to his face and hands. He was riding his tractor because he didn't have a car to drive. Daddy picked a pasteboard box full of food for him, jars of canned vegetables, a loaf of bread, candy, a pack of peanuts. Whatever we had a surplus of he put in the box for the old man. The man carefully fit the box on the three-point hitch of the tractor. "Thank you, Mr. Frank, thank you." That's what he said over and over in his deep, low, gravelly voice. But it had been raining, and there was a big pothole in the driveway. When the old man went through the bog, the tractor bounced wildly. I was watching out in the kitchen, and the box of food leaped off the tractor and sailed into the deep puddle. The old man plunged down on the brake and rushed back to rescue his food. Nothing was broken, and Daddy helped him dry it and box it back up and tie it more securely to the tractor. I heard stories from Mom and Daddy about a man and woman in the 1940s buying a 5-cent ice cream and eating from the same cone, or a woman in the 1950s carrying on as tickled as if Santa Claus had come because she had ice. She was going to have iced tea, a luxury since they didn't have refrigeration. Another extremely poor family, the man Dip Tar, lived in a shanty with no furniture and few clothes. These people slept on pine straw ticking. When I was a girl, surrounded by poverty, the word free meant something to me. It had an attraction to it. If something was free, we could afford it. I ordered every free recipe or cookbook available on the sides of oatmeal boxes or bags of sugar. I sent off cereal box tops and got a 50-cent refund plus 10 cents for the stamp I'd used. Ordered booklets telling how to make gifts with aluminum pie tins and instructions for making money selling grit newspapers. I clipped every 10-cent coupon off, although we seldom bought anything but staples and store brand at that. We were poor but solvent and surrounded by people much poorer. The junkyard was bordered with a series of row houses that were without electricity or running water. Lizzie and Willie Miller lived in the first. Their furniture was spare and simple, and the house was always mopped and clean. Lizzie kept her grassless yard swept with a broom brush and an old cracker style of fire prevention. They had an outhouse out back that attracted us intensely, so we would go stare across our hog wire fence into its sinking hole. From a greater distance we watched Willie go in and come out of it, and we snickered among ourselves as children will do. The squeaking of Willie's pump as he drew water could be heard easily in our yard. He kept a bucketful with a dipper in the kitchen. Willie was a dozen years older than his wife, although the age difference wasn't barely discernible, since Willie tottered around uncertainly, weaving and wagging his body, taking baby steps as he walked. He had survived a train accident in 1955. Daddy had been standing at the window of Granny Clio's cafe when someone said, "There's a man lying in the street." It was real foggy morning, and the train was coming to a halt at the crossing. Before the engine wadded up like a mouse before
Maryland here today? Hold on, we got a test. I sent you an email. Adams.
Guardo tu computadora y así comer con estos 2 días de personas de la clase. Guardo tu computadora y haces tus cosas.
Before the engine wadded up like a mouse before a cat and pushed along the track was what had been a black truck, but what was now nothing more than a snarled roll of black metal. The train had rammed the truck at the last street, and it had taken a block to stop. The man in the street was dead. Daddy had run from the cafe, not toward the dead man, but toward the train. Another man was trapped inside the truck that had rolled around him like a newspaper around a mess of fish, but he was alive. And that was Willie Miller. The men were heading to the Turpentine woods early in the morning, and had not seen the train. Willie, who had lost many of his teeth in the accident, loved to suck on peppermint. He would suck a peppermint stick small and round and lick the point on one end, then hold it in its place against the gum with his tongue. If any of his kids came round, he'd ask, have I showed you my new tooth? No, we'd say, and he'd open his mouth. It's pointed, Steve would say, it looks funny. Are you saying you don't like my new tooth? Willie would ask. I like it, Steve would reply, but it doesn't look right. And then Willie would grotesquely drop the tooth, and we would realize it was peppermint, and we had been fooled. Peppermint, we would laugh, so Willie would go inside and break a stick into pieces for us. In the house past Willie and Lizzie's for a while lived a couple named Cotton and Hilda. They had little money.
Hello. Does anyone have books they need to return? Because we're taking up books.
In the house past Willie and Lizzie's for a while lived a couple named Cotton and Hilda. They had little money and a slew of bedraggled barefoot children. We were barefoot too. All I can remember is that we had to deliver something, maybe a piece of a carburetor Cotton had traded, and when we approached the sagging shanty, a skinny girl came out. She was tow-headed and eating a drumstick. The chicken was raw. After Willie and Lizzie had to go to the nursing home, an old woman of the night moved in. She, too, had spent time in Milledgeville, but when she returned she said, "Wasn't anybody crazy where I was in Milledgeville. Everybody in there had good sense, looked like to me." She wore a house coat around all day, and her face was red and splotched, her legs swollen. She was visited by old married men who parked down the road and crossed our yard to her door, their caps turned backward. A quarter-mile away, John and Helen Hyatt lived without electricity or indoor plumbing in a dirt floor shanty sided with tar paper, scraps of tin, and gypsum boards. It was situated on a dirt road behind the junkyard in Lowland. The county had tried to drain. It teemed with mosquitoes, and the water that pumped from John and Helen's shallow well erupted white from the ground, saturated with clay. Still, they poured it in jars to settle the sediment and drank it, claiming to like the taste and calling it medicinal. They had no choice, and for years they had made a living by driving a mule and a sled from garden to garden around town, growing on halves, meaning the party who owned the land and the one who supplied labor, seeds, and fertilizer would split the produce in half. John sold his share to stores in the town until customers began to complain of dog hairs in the greens. Now they lived on a pittance of a government pension in a thin, ragged garden. They loved dogs. They had at least 30 of them at a time, scraggly and raucous, pinned behind their squat shanty. They would not pass over a stray. Even when they had little to nothing, the dogs ate. The dogs needed a mange treatment. If the dogs needed a mange treatment, John dipped them in a purple wash that left them looking bruised and electrified. John and Helen's back door opened into a dog pen, fashioned out of bits of hog wire, rotting slabs of plywood, and half pieces of rusty tin, and the dogs lived as much in the house as in the pen. Sometimes we carried them meat scraps when we had extra, and watched the dogs fight over bones tossed across the fence. No amount of money could have persuaded us to enter that fence. The dogs as a pack were ferocious, and ever so often a fight would break out between 2 or 3 of them, and Helen would wade into them, screeching at them to stop. John and Helen had no transportation, but they didn't ask anybody for anything. When they needed food, they made the 2-mile walk to the nearest grocery store. Helen was 20 years younger than John, and she would push a wheelbarrow in order to bring home the groceries and the sacks of dog food. John must have been in his 70s. When he gave out on the trip, he got into a wheelbarrow and Helen pushed him home. I saw them pass the house many a time, Helen pushing John. In the rural South, the land of longleaf pine, these were the pictures travelers remembered: tar paper tobacco shanties, bent over women in the cotton fields, shoeless school children, chain gangs, bathrooms for whites only, Saturday afternoon towns spangled with mule farmers in faded and patched overalls, and not a dime in their pockets. Passing through my homeland, it was easy to see that Crackers, although fiercely rooted in the land and willing to defend it to the death, hadn't had the means, the education, or the ease to care particularly about its natural communities. Our relationship with the land wasn't one of give and return. The land itself had been the victim of social dilemmas, racial injustice, lack of education, and dire poverty. It was overtilled, eroded, cut, littered, polluted, treated as a commodity, sometimes the only one, and not as a living thing. Most people worried about getting by, and when getting by meant using the land, we used it. When getting by meant ignoring the land, we ignored it.